Hello everyone. Today I'm continuing my series on Eschatology, the study of the end times, and I'm continuing my sub-series on the fulfillment of the Olivet Discourse. In this video, I'm talking more about the second half of the Olivet Discourse and continuing my argument that the whole discourse is about events in the first century instead of being divided into two different topics. So let's begin by reading the full text that I'll be covering. Matthew 24:34 to 25:31 says, "Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven nor the Son, but the Father alone. For just as the days of Noah were, so the coming of the Son of Man will be. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark, and they did not understand, until the flood came and took them all away. So will the coming of the Son of Man be. Then there will be two in the field, one will be taken and one will be left. Two women will be grinding grain at the mill, one will be taken and one will be left. Therefore stay awake, for you do not know which day your Lord is coming. But be sure of this, that if the head of the house had known at what time of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and would not have allowed his house to be broken into. For this reason you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour when you do not think he will. Who then is the faithful and prudent slave whom his master put in charge of his household to give them their food at the proper time? Blessed is that slave whom his master finds so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you that he will put him in charge of all his possessions. But if that evil slave says in his heart, my master is not coming for a long time, and begins to beat his fellow slaves, and eat and drink with drunkards, the master of that slave will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour which he does not know, and will cut him in pieces and assign him a place with the hypocrites. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the kingdom of heaven may be compared to 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. Now 5 of them were foolish, and 5 were prudent. For when the foolish took their lamps, they took no oil with them, but the prudent took oil in flasks along with their lamps. Now while the bridegroom was delaying, they all got drowsy and began to sleep. But at midnight there was a shout, behold, the bridegroom come out to meet him. Then all those virgins rose and trimmed their lamps. And the foolish said to the prudent, give us some of your oil, for our lamps are going out. But the prudent answered, saying, no, there will not be enough for us and for you too. Go instead to the dealers and buy some for yourselves. And while they were going away to make the purchase, the bridegroom came, and those who were ready went in with him to the wedding feast, and the door was shut. And later the other virgins also came, saying, Lord, Lord, open up for us. But he answered and said, truly I say to you, I do not know you. Therefore stay awake, for you do not know the day nor the hour. For it is just like a man about to go on a journey, who called his own slaves and handed over his possessions to them. And to one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1, each according to his own ability, and he went on his journey. Immediately the one who had received the 5 talents went and traded with them, and gained 5 more talents. In the same manner the one who had received the 2 talents gained 2 more. But he who received the 1 talent went away and dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money. Now after a long time the master of those slaves came and settled accounts with them. And the one who had received the 5 talents came up and brought 5 more talents, saying, Master, you handed 5 talents over to me. See, I have gained 5 more talents. His master said to him, well done, good and faithful slave. You were faithful with a few things. I'll put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. Also the one who had received the 2 talents came up and said, Master, you handed 2 talents over to me. See, I have gained 2 more talents. His master said to him, well done, good and faithful slave. You were faithful with a few things. I'll put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. And the one who had received the 1 talent came up and said, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you scattered no seed. And I was afraid, and I went away and hid your talent in the ground. See, you have what is yours. But his master answered and said to him, you wicked, lazy slave, you knew that I reap where I did not sow, and gather where I scattered no seed. Therefore you ought to have put my money in the bank, and on my arrival I would have received my money back with interest. Therefore take away the talent from him, and give it to the one who has the 10 talents. For to everyone who has, more shall be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who does not have, even what he does have shall be taken away. And throw out the worthless slave into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. But when the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. I made several arguments in my last video for why this passage cannot be separated from the first half of the discourse, and therefore must be about first century events. But commentator Kenneth L. Gentry Jr., who I have quoted positively many times, lists 13 arguments in his book, The Olivet Discourse Made Easy, for why the discourse should be divided, believing that Jesus is talking about his final advent from Matthew 24:36 onwards. So in this video, I will address all of his arguments and prove him wrong by refuting them. His first argument is that this generation will not pass away until all these things take place is a concluding statement, which indicates that Jesus is done talking about whatever he was talking about before and is about to move on to a different subject. But there are problems with this idea, even according to his own hermeneutic. All preterists argue that this generation clearly means their first century generation, because everywhere else the phrase is used in Scripture, that's what it's referring to. By the same logic, if verse 34 is a concluding statement in the way Gentry says, then the same statement elsewhere would be a concluding statement in this way. But this is simply not the case. Earlier in the discourse, Jesus says in Matthew 23:34-38, On account of this, behold, I am sending you prophets and wise men and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify, and some of them you will flog in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, so that upon you may fall the guilt of all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her, how often I wanted to gather your children together the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you did not want it. Behold, your house is being left to you desolate. Jesus is clearly talking about the same events of their generation, both before and after he says all these things will come upon this generation. And even according to Gentry, he keeps talking about it for 35 verses after this. Regarding Matthew 24:34, Gentry asks, why would such a statement be inserted 1/4 of the way through the discourse if it were dealing in its entirety with events that were to occur in this generation? However, this is a false question. Matthew 24:34 is not 1/4 of the way through the discourse, but actually over halfway through it. Gentry asserts that the discourse begins in 24:4, but this is simply not true. Clearly, the discourse includes chapter 23, because chapter 23 is not a narrative section and is about the same thing as chapter 24. Many scholars recognize that this is the case, and that these 3 chapters are all one literary unit. So the statement is not just inserted one time, 1/4 of the way in, but is instead inserted twice, the latter of which is in the beginning of the second half. If Jesus continues with the same time frame after the first insertion, why can't he after the second? In his book, Reading Matthew, Trusting Jesus, Jonathan Sedlak says, even if one accepts that Matthew 24:34 functions as a concluding statement of some kind, which is a dubious proposition, and verse 35 confirms Jesus' previous pronouncements, it is still not necessary to assume that the prophecy which preceded it is in response to the disciples' first question in 24:3 regarding when these things shall be. Gentry assumes that their next question is following a chronological progression of A, B, A prime, B prime. As I have shown, Jesus is asked a series of questions, and he begins by responding to the last question first. Gentry declares that it would not make sense to insert a concluding statement 1/4 of the way through the discourse. I agree. That would be a very odd transitional point within a discourse. Such polemics, of course, assume that Gentry has properly identified Matthew's literary structure. Matthew's literary structure follows a chiastic A, B, C, C prime, B prime, A prime pattern. In light of that, it seems stranger to argue for a hinge passage halfway through section B prime, as Gentry insists, which is not even remotely close to the typical location of a hinge within a chiastically organized discourse. The hinge of a chiastic structure, whether the hinge is conceptual or thematic, occurs within its central sections, C and C prime. Also notice that both this generation statements are in the B and B prime sections of Christ's discourse, which bolsters the chiastic structure and helps unify chapters 23 to 25. Furthermore, let's also look at how the statement is used in Luke's version of the discourse. Luke 21:32 to 36 says, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. But be on guard, so that your hearts will not be overcome with dissipation and drunkenness and the worries of life. And that day will not come on you suddenly like a trap, for it will come upon all those who inhabit the face of all the earth. But keep on the alert at all times, praying earnestly that you may have strength to escape all these things that are about to take place, and to stand before the Son of Man. He says they should stay alert in order to escape all these things that are about to take place. Not only is this a clear reference to the same things he said would occur in their generation immediately prior, but he even adds another near time indicator by saying they are about to take place. So obviously Jesus is still talking about the same thing even after the alleged concluding statement. Therefore, Luke 21:32 and Matthew 24:34 are not concluding statements at all, and the same is true in Mark 13 as well. So Gentry's first argument holds absolutely no weight. Now, Gentry's second argument is from the use of the Greek phrase peride at the beginning of verse 36. Now, he's correct that peride often indicates a sort of change of subject elsewhere in Matthew and in Paul's epistles, but the way he applies it here is without warrant. Gentry says in Matthew 24:36, Perry reaches back to the disciples' second question of the two that were raised in verse 3. Having dealt with their first question in verses 4 through 35, he now returns to consider their second one. By this structuring of the passage, we see that verse 36 introduces new material differing from verses 4 through 35. At this point, he moves away from his 80-70 prophecy and begins speaking of his second advent at the end of the age, which he will cover in 24:36 to 25:46. There is a major problem here. As Gentry himself points out later in his sixth argument, verses 4 through 35 are filled with historical signs. He says thus he is informing his disciples who asked him the questions, how they might know the time of the coming end of the temple. It is a predictable event. But if verses 4 through 35 answer the first question, and 24:36 through 25:46 answer the second question, as Gentry asserts, then we have a big inconsistency. Remember, the disciples' questions were 1, when will this happen? And 2, what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? They only asked about signs in their second question, and yet Gentry says Jesus only talks about signs in the part he says is answering their first question. And the part Gentry says is an answer to the second question sounds like an answer to the first. No one knows the day or the hour when these things will happen. Also, as a side note, according to Gentry, the coming end of the temple, Matthew 24:2 and 14, is not the end of the age that the disciples actually asked about in their questions in verse 3. He argues that the disciples were confused about the end of the age, and that it is still in our future, even though the text doesn't even remotely imply that, as I showed in my last video. Now, Gentry does point out that the Greek word for end in the phrase the end of the age in 24:3 is suntelea, and that's not the same as the one in verse 14, which is telos. And so he argues that Jesus is therefore not talking about the end of the age that the disciples asked about. However, the words are closely related, and the meaning of telos is also related to the meaning of aeon, the word for age, which means a space of time or a period of history, while telos means the end of a period of time. And whereas telos refers to the very end point of a time period, suntelea refers to the time period of the end, meaning the telos is actually just the very end of the suntelea. There is no reason to separate them and pretend that Jesus is talking about something else entirely unrelated to what his disciples asked about. They didn't ask about a telos apart from the suntelea they asked about, nor did Jesus mention any telos prior to their questions. So he can't be referring to any end other than the end of the age in Matthew 24:14, especially given that in the very next verse he refers to the abomination of desolation, which according to the Greek version of Daniel 12 was to come at the suntelea of the aeon. Additionally, the word suntelea is used in another passage to specifically refer to the first century period of transition from the Old Covenant to the New Covenant. Hebrews 8:13 and 9:26 says, "When he said a new covenant, he has made the first obsolete, but whatever is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to disappear. Otherwise, he would have needed to suffer often since the foundation of the world, but now, once at the consummation of the ages, he has been manifested to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself." The suntelea here began no later than Christ's crucifixion, and it ended with the telos at the destruction of the temple when the Old Covenant order passed away. So one reason Jesus probably used the word telos in Matthew 24:14 instead of suntelea is because he was talking about the end point that was still coming in the future and would not arrive until the gospel was preached throughout the Roman Empire, whereas the suntelea was either about to begin at the crucifixion a few days later or perhaps had even already started. But now back to Gentry's argument regarding verse 36 and what peri de means. He says peri, concerning, can pick up on a subject broached earlier in a narrative by serving as a sign that the speaker is returning to that issue once again. This function operates in Matthew 22. In verses 23 to 28, the Sadducees came to him and questioned him about the resurrection, giving a hypothetical example of a woman who was married 7 times. In verses 29 to 30, Jesus deals with their example. Then in verse 31, he reaches back to their original question about the resurrection and states, "But regarding peri de, the resurrection of the dead, have you not... Once again, we see the resumptive force of the preposition peri. But it's not that he just addresses the example by itself and then addresses the question by itself, because the example is explicitly part of the question. There is only one topic, and Jesus is clearly still talking about this same topic, even after using peri de here. His whole answer is about the resurrection and why the Sadducees are wrong about it. After peri de, he relies on what he already said, while also reaching back again to their question. The same is true in the Olivet Discourse. Again, Matthew 24:35 to 36 says, "Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven nor the Son, but the Father alone." It is obvious that the day and hour here is the day and hour of the passing away of heaven and earth, which happened in AD 70, as I showed in previous videos, which is also the day and hour of the coming of the Son of Man, referred to in verses 27 and 30, which were to happen in this generation. Sedlak says, "Peri de is not limited in function to a complete change in subject. It can also segue into multiple aspects of the same subject, like when certain signs will occur instead of what certain signs will occur, or subtopics that are related to a broader issue or concern in the context." Gentry fails to point this out. Without any obvious contextual reason for insisting upon a complete change in historical situation, peri de remains a predictable grammatical invitation to ponder one perspective among many within a conversation, and without necessarily changing the main topic or concern of that conversation. Gentry appeals to Paul's first letter to the Corinthians to prove his point. He claims that in each case he, Paul, is clearly introducing new subjects that respond to different questions presented to him. Two things about this argument immediately stand out. One, Gentry admits that all of these new subjects are in response to different questions presented to Paul, and two, each question falls under the rubric now concerning peri de, the things about which you wrote, 1 Corinthians 7:1. Paul is certainly responding to different topics written to him or questions presented to him. Each example of peri de across 1 Corinthians 7 seems to be in response to questions or concerns they addressed to authorities within the church. Paul then seems to be responding to various topics under a general rubric, the things about which you wrote. Since Paul became aware of their questions or concerns, it is reasonable to expect peri de to segue within a conversation as he responds to them. At the same time, Paul uses peri de to segue within multiple aspects of a wider-ranging concern he wishes to cover succinctly. This is clearly seen in 1 Corinthians 7:25. Paul does not merely say, "Now concerning virgins." He says, "Now concerning virgins I have no command from the Lord, but I give my judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy." This notion of a command from the Lord is used like a thread, pulling together pieces of a much broader concern across 1 Corinthians 7:1-24, and specifically echoes verses 10 to 12. So then, even within Gentry's own set of proof texts for a hinged passage, Paul illustrates that peri de can be used to change subjects and also segue into different aspects of a more comprehensive issue, such as one's calling as a Christian within a terminal generation. Gentry also argues alongside Gibbs that the lone preposition peri can in and of itself have a resumptive force. That is to say, peri occasionally picks up on a portion of an earlier statement and resumes an initial concern within a conversation. Interestingly, Gentry does not realize that this actually makes better sense of the questions asked in Matthew 24:3 and Jesus' inverted response to them, beginning with the last question first. I'm not opposed to the argument that peri is used with resumptive force in Matthew 24:36. That is actually quite helpful if accurate. Jesus would then be very clear about responding to the first question last in 24:36 to 25:46 because he already began by answering the last question first. Since Jesus begins by answering their last question first, it makes sense to resume their initial concern of when these things will happen at verse 36 by responding to their first question last. Resuming their initial concern about when these things will happen makes sense in context. Paul is still talking about the same overall subject throughout 1 Corinthians 7 and uses peride to answer different related questions regarding that one subject. So there was no reason to think Jesus isn't doing the same thing in Matthew 24 instead of changing the topic entirely. Additionally, as Gentry himself points out elsewhere, Luke 21 often takes what Mark 13 says and rewords it so that Gentiles can understand it better. See Mark 13:14-20 and Matthew 24:15-22 compared to Luke 21:20-24. But Luke's interpretation of what Jesus says in Mark 13:32 and Matthew 24:36 is not the same as Gentry's. Again, Luke 21:33-36 says, "Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. But be on guard, so that your hearts will not be overcome with dissipation and drunkenness and the worries of life, and that day will not come on you suddenly like a trap. For it will come upon all those who inhabit the face of all the earth. But keep on the alert at all times, praying earnestly that you may have strength to escape all these things that are about to take place, and to stand before the Son of Man." Right after repeating that the generation wouldn't pass away and that heaven and earth would, instead of saying, "but of that day and hour," like Mark and Matthew do, Luke instead says, "but be on guard." Jesus is telling his first century disciples to be on guard for all the signs he just told them about because they don't know the exact time of the end. Jesus mentions that day here in Luke, just like in Mark and Matthew, and also says it would come on you if they didn't stay on guard, referring to the disciples he was speaking to, not people thousands of years later, since he says the events are about to take place. So if the things in the second half of the discourse are about the first century in Luke, then obviously they are about the first century in Mark and Matthew as well, and Gentry's second argument cannot hold any weight. But Gentry's sixth argument, which I already mentioned, is that Jesus only talks about signs in the first half and not the second half, which he says is an intentional contrast. However, this is only evidence for Jesus talking about two separate events if you presuppose that he is talking about two separate events. If Jesus is talking about his first century coming the whole time, then he doesn't even need to talk about signs of that coming in the second part because he already talked about them in the first part when he answered the disciples' question about the signs. Why would he explain what the signs are a second time when answering the when question? Furthermore, Jesus repeatedly told his disciples to stay watchful in the second part of his discourse, but if he was talking about a different coming that has no signs and that would happen thousands of years after their deaths, then what on earth was he telling them to watch for? Sedlak says this is a poorly developed argument. Notice again that Gentry underlines historical signs with first century fulfillment as though Jesus is addressing the last question about signs first. Gentry even emphasizes a preeminent sign, which corresponds nicely with the literary structure I proposed. Gentry's interpretation of absolute surprise and total unpredictability also does not conflict with anything I proposed. I do not doubt that surprise and unpredictability can be highlighted within Jesus' Olivet Discourse. I merely doubt, for many cogent reasons, that Jesus is suddenly transitioning completely out of his situational context to the distant future at the end of the world. According to Josephus, Jewish Wars, Book 6, Chapter 9, Sections 3 and 4, over 200,000 animals were sacrificed in Jerusalem for the Passover as the Roman siege began. If one projects, as Josephus does, that at least 10 people belonged to one paschal lamb, for it is not lawful for them to feast singly by themselves, we are left with an exponentially larger number of people trapped in the city. Josephus estimated that Jerusalem was crowded with more than 2 million people as the Roman army encompassed the city, leaving them all trapped as in a prison. Even if that number was arbitrarily reduced to a quarter of the estimated amount, it still remains reasonable to visualize an entrapment of over 500,000 people as appearing sudden and unpredictable. Therefore, when compared with Josephus' estimation, even with exceedingly low figures, it still seems reasonable to perceive Jesus speaking in terms of sudden and unpredictable first-century fulfillment, even though the exact day and hour was altogether unknown within that generation, as Gentry asserts. So Gentry's sixth argument also completely falls apart. But next we have Gentry's third argument. Matthew 24:36 says that the Son doesn't know the day or the hour, and Gentry says here Christ states that in his state of humiliation he himself has no knowledge as to when that day and hour will occur. He must be speaking of his future second advent, because in the preceding section of his discourse he tells his disciples that numerous signs will be given, but that the end of the temple is not yet. Matthew 24:6. This indicates that he definitely knows when that event will occur. He also dogmatically teaches them that these earlier things will certainly happen in this generation. 24:34. First, notice how Gentry has to add the words "of the temple" in brackets in Matthew 24:6 in order to support his framework, when the only end mentioned earlier in the text itself is the end of the age that the disciples asked about, and Jesus is not claimed to have clarified any distinction in his answer to their questions until all the way down in verse 36, which is much later. How else could the disciples who asked the questions understand what Jesus was saying? Second, just because Jesus knows the events that will happen and that they will happen before the end of the generation simply does not mean that he knows the exact time of the end. The fact that Jesus says the end is not yet only shows that he knows more events must yet occur before the end, not that he knows exactly when the end is. Third, the word translated hour often means season, see John 5:25-29 and 1 John 2:18, etc. And it's possible that might be how it's being used here because of verse 20. Matthew 24:20 says, "But pray that your flight will not be in the winter or on a Sabbath." Regardless of what hour means in verse 36, the Sabbath is a day and the winter is a season of the year. And even though the disciples know everything will happen in their generation, they are still told to pray that it won't be in the season of winter or on a Sabbath day because they do not know the exact timing of the events. So Gentry's idea that a different coming is indicated by the day and hour being unknown is explicitly refuted by the text itself. Fourth, Gentry himself interprets the exact same language elsewhere as applying to AD 70, which invalidates his argumentation in Matthew 24. Revelation 3:3-10 says, "So remember what you have received and heard, and keep it, and repent. Therefore, if you do not wake up, I will come like a thief, and you will not know at what hour I will come to you. Because you have kept the word of my perseverance, I also will keep you from the hour of testing which is about to come upon the whole world, to test those who dwell on the earth. I am coming quickly. Hold fast what you have, so that no one will take your crown." Revelation 9:15 says, "And the 4 angels were released who had been prepared for the hour and day and month and year, so that they would kill a third of mankind." Revelation 14:7-15 says, "And he said with a loud voice, Fear God and give him glory, because the hour of his judgment has come. Worship him who made the heaven and the earth and sea and springs of waters." Another angel came out of the sanctuary, crying out with a loud voice to him who sits on the cloud, "Put in your sickle and reap, for the hour to reap has come, because the harvest of the earth is ripe." Revelation 18:9-10 and 19 says, "And the kings of the earth who committed sexual immorality and lived sensuously with her will cry and lament over her when they see the smoke of her burning, standing at a distance because of the fear of her torment, saying, Woe, woe, the great city Babylon, the strong city, for in 1 hour your judgment has come. And they threw dust on their heads and were crying out, crying and mourning, saying, Woe, woe to the great city, in which all who have ships at sea become rich by her wealth, for in 1 hour she has been laid waste." In Revelation 3:3, Jesus says the church at Sardis, who had the signs and everything else given in the discourse as well as the book of Revelation itself, still didn't know exactly at what hour I will come to you. In his 2-volume commentary on the book of Revelation, Gentry correctly applies all of these verses to the first century. Sedlak says, in argument number 2, Gentry declared dogmatically that the end of the age question referred to Christ's second advent. But here, in argument number 3, Gentry asserts that the signs of the end inform disciples that the end of the temple is not yet. In this argument, Gentry underlines the literary fact that in the preceding section of his discourse, 24:4-35, Jesus informs his disciples of numerous signs. With this rationale, Gentry is showing clearly, although unwittingly, that Jesus' language about the end and the signs accompanying it are all addressed in 24:4-35. If one takes for granted that Jesus' human limitations are being emphasized by this phrase, this does not logically lead to Gentry's conclusion about 2 contrasted events in history, separated by thousands of years. Gentry argues that in Jesus' human nature, he definitely knows when the destruction of the temple will occur. It will take place in this generation. Gentry then leaps to the conclusion that there must be a second event in the distant future, because Jesus does not know that day and hour. Notice carefully that Gentry's conclusion does not logically follow his premises. Human limitations can definitely include knowledge about an event within a specific generation, and yet still not know the exact day and hour when the event will occur within it. For example, as a human being, I can be dogmatically certain that I will die in this generation. As a human being, I have limited knowledge, but my knowledge is not so limited as to be uncertain about the generation in which my death will occur, and yet such certainty does not contradict another human limitation of my own, which is not knowing what day and hour I will die. In light of this, it becomes clear that when Gentry asks, "But of what day and hour is he, Jesus, speaking?" Gentry assumes that a particular day and hour could not possibly refer to a day or hour within that generation. It is precisely because of Jesus' human limitations, his humiliation limitation, that it remains logically possible for Jesus to be uncertain about the precise day and hour of the Father's judgment, and also know for certain that it will occur within that same generation. Thus, it is clear that not knowing the day, the hour, or even the season of the events Jesus prophesied doesn't mean he changed the subject. Gentry's third argument is absurd. Next, in his fourth argument, Gentry correctly says that there are temporal markers showing the order of events in Matthew 24:4-31, such as then and immediately after, and he argues that the lack of a marker like this in verse 36 shows that it is about events thousands of years after what came before. But this argument makes absolutely no sense, and it presupposes the truth of his view, as do argument 6 and several others I haven't covered yet. As I said, Jesus does shift subtopics in verses 34-36, since before that he answers the second question and deals with the chronology of the signs of his coming and the end of the age. In verses 34-36, he says it will all happen in that generation, but the exact time is unknown. And then after that, he gives parables to teach them to stay alert and be watchful for the signs he told them of. Why would there even need to be a temporal marker after verse 34? Describing an order of events is not the purpose of the second half of the discourse. But actually, despite that, there still is a temporal marker in the second half of the discourse. It's in Matthew 25, verse 1. But Gentry doesn't want you to notice that. And if anything, a temporal marker would be needed for Gentry's interpretation to be true, not mine, because he views the day and the hour as being something after verses 27 to 30 instead of being the same event. By Gentry's logic, we would expect Jesus to have said, "But of that day and hour of my coming and the end of the age, which will be a long time after this, no one knows except the Father alone." Sedlak says, "I do not deny that a literary transition of some sort takes place at 24:36. Verse 36 begins Jesus' answer to his disciples' first question. But what was their first question about? Was it about the end of our world or the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in their own generation? Certainly, the overwhelming majority of historical support is found in Jerusalem's destruction. It is only because Gentry assumes a temporal progression from a limited first century context to a seemingly unlimited end of our world context that his argument from so-called temporal markers appears relevant. Based on the research of Alistair Wilson about parables, a lack of temporal progress indicators after 24:36 is completely and demonstrably irrelevant." But Gentry also makes another argument regarding time indicators, which is his 13th and final one. He says, "In the early section of Matthew 24, the time frame is short. The disciples will be facing real dangers that will transpire in this generation," Matthew 24:34. "They are to be on the lookout for various signs and are to flee the area." In the following section from Matthew 24:36 and into chapter 25, the time frame is much longer. No more do we hear of this generation. Rather, Jesus' parables anticipate a distant future, Matthew 24:48, 25:5, and 19. But Matthew 24:45-51 says, "Who then is the faithful and prudent slave whom his master put in charge of his household, to give them their food at the proper time? Blessed is that slave whom his master finds so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you that he will put him in charge of all his possessions. But if that evil slave says in his heart, 'My master is not coming for a long time,' and begins to beat his fellow slaves, and eat and drink with drunkards, the master of that slave will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour which he does not know, and will cut him in pieces, and assign him a place with the hypocrites. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." Clearly, it is the evil slave who thinks it will be a long time, and so he can do whatever he wants. But then instead, the master comes when the evil slave doesn't expect him, meaning it had to be sooner than the evil slave thought it would be, rather than thousands of years later after the slave is long dead. The master clearly returns to the same slave he left, not a distant descendant, so it clearly had to be in that generation, as verse 34 says. Then Matthew 25:1, 5, and 13 says, "Then the kingdom of heaven may be compared," that's the temporal marker, "to 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. Now while the bridegroom was delaying, they all got drowsy and began to sleep. Therefore stay awake, for you do not know the day nor the hour." Just because the bridegroom was delaying doesn't mean he delays for thousands of years. The parable begins with the virgins going out to meet him, which they would only do if they expected him relatively soon based on seeing the signs Jesus talked about. Then after they go out is when he delays, but then he eventually does come to those same virgins that went out to meet him before the delay. So because the same virgins are alive both before and after the delay, and because the only reason they would go out to meet him would be because they saw the signs that came in that generation, the delay can thus be no more than a few years long and within that generation, not thousands of years long. The admonition to stay awake is Gregoreo in Greek, which literally means to watch. This relates to 24:33, where Jesus says, "So you too, when you see all these things, recognize that he is near," right at the door. And Matthew 25:10 says, "And while they were going away to make the purchase, the bridegroom came, and those who were ready went in with him to the wedding feast, and the door was shut." This is clearly paralleled in Revelation 19, which Gentry applies to the first century in his commentary. Revelation 19:7-9 says, "Let us rejoice and be glad, and give the glory to him, for the marriage of the Lamb has come, and his bride has made herself ready. And it was given to her to clothe herself in fine linen, bright and clean, for the fine linen is the righteous acts of the saints. Then he said to me, Write, Blessed are those who are invited to the marriage supper of the Lamb. And he said to me, These are the true words of God." Gentry correctly argues that the marriage supper of the Lamb began in AD 70 after Christ came to divorce Old Covenant Israel and marry the New Covenant Church. But if the bridegroom already came to marry the bride in AD 70, and that's when the feast began, then it is obvious that the parable of the 10 virgins must have been fulfilled at this time. Now Matthew 25:14 and 19 says, "For it is just like a man about to go on a journey who called his own slaves and handed over his possessions to him. Now after a long time, the master of those slaves came and settled accounts with them." Gentry uses this as his third and final example of a distinction between short and long-term timing indicators, but like the first two, it doesn't really help his case. First, as I said before, the master explicitly comes back to the very same individuals he left at the beginning, indicating a time frame of no more than a lifetime. This is literally emphasized in the text, twice. Second, the phrase long time appears elsewhere in Scripture and literally never means more than a generation, with the lengthiest usage elsewhere being a period of 38 years in John 5:5-6. Thus, a length of 40 years in Matthew 25 makes perfect sense. An entire generation does happen to be a long time, after all. Third, this parable of the talents is closely paralleled by the parable of the minas in Luke 19:11-28, which is explicitly connected to his first century coming to destroy Jerusalem. Sedlak says Gentry's selective proof texting is curious. First, he insists that the early section of Matthew 24 describes a short time frame. Even though Matthew 24:22 mentions short twice, his defense of a short time frame does not come from appealing to the term short, but instead comes from the phrase this generation. Whereas in the following section, Gentry highlights the phrase a long time in 25:19, as though that definitively settles the time frame in which these statements reach their intended fulfillment. Looking closely at Matthew 24:22, which Gentry does not do, Jesus mentions that days will be cut short for the sake of the elect, thereby implying that those days would seem long to those awaiting his promised judgment upon the temple. In light of this seemingly lengthy period of waiting that would be cut short within this generation, an interpretation which Gentry assigns to first century fulfillment, Gentry's insistence that the parables following 24:36 anticipate a distant future at the end of human history is manifestly contrived. Now, I was planning to refute all of Gentry's arguments in one video, but I'm barely half done at this point. I've only covered 6 out of 13, and this video is already too long, so I'm going to have to divide it into 2 parts and cover the rest of his arguments later. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. God bless.